Most leftists aren't using the language that they do because they've read the primary sources. They're doing it out of some convention, some social convention that was completely artificially created by someone who pretended to interpret it the right way, who didn't, so it just took off. Let's give an introduction to what Dimitrov actually meant by fascism, right? It's the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. Most reactionary variety of fascism is the German type. German fascism is acting as the spearhead of international counter-revolution, the chief instigator of imperialist war, and the initiator of a crusade against the Soviet Union, the great fatherland of the working people of the whole world. Now, who is the chief instigator of war in America right now, of imperialist war? Who is the chief instigator? Well, I can name two people. It used to be the neocons. Now it's the progressives. I repeat that. The self-proclaimed progressives in the United States of America, even more than Biden, are the chief instigators of imperialist war against Russia, against China over Taiwan, yada, yada, yada. Okay? Who are the most solid anti-war people? It seems like the most solid anti-war contingent among the American public right now are populists across the board. It goes from the MAGA people to us. They're anti-war with regard to Russia, but there are elements from the top, specifically the Teal Bannon contingent, and if I'm mischaracterizing them, they can defend themselves, and I'll be open to that. But it seems like they kind of want to push for war with China using a populist veneer, but they're nowhere at the level of progressives who actually have an ideological basis for a crusade. A literal crusade is what Dimitrov said against Russia and China for ideological reasons. That we have to spread democracy, we have to spread LGBT rights, we have to spread the Dalai Lama and free Tibet, we have to spread land back. That's what these fucking people are. They're fascists, right? So I want you guys to listen to this as well. Fascism is not a form of state power standing above classes. It's not a revolt of the petty bourgeoisie. Fascism is not a power standing above class, nor government of the petty bourgeoisie or the lumpen over finance capital. Fascism is the power of finance capital itself. Dimitrov made that crystal clear. It's not the power of industrial capital, which is what Trump overwhelmingly represented. It is the power of finance capital. Okay? Now, if that somehow changed, you're going to have to explain to me why that changed. It is the organization of terrorist vengeance against the working class and the revolutionary section of the peasantry and intelligentsia. Oh, boy, that sounds a lot like Antifa to me. Terrorist vengeance against the working class. And foreign policy, it's jingoism in its most brutal form, fomenting bestial hatred of other nations. What kind of attitude have progressives fomented in regards to the attitude toward Russia and China? Have you guys seen some of these tweets about Russia? Did you see the tweet about Russia where they said, Russia has always been the bloody state of Muscovy. We must crush the horde. You guys see that shit? Did you see the shit that they're saying about China? You're going to tell me that isn't jingoism in its most brutal form and fomenting bestial hatred against other nations? I mean, it's clear as day. That's exactly what it fucking is. The true character of fascism must be particularly stressed because in a number of countries, under the cover of social demagoguery, fascism is meant to gain a following of the mass of the petty bourgeoisie that has been dislocated by crisis and even sections of the backward strata of the proletariat. But these would have never supported fascism if they understood their real character and true nature. So that might happen in this country if, for example, these Azovite Nazlibs start presenting their agenda in this populist veneer against China. That could get the masses on board with their agenda. Right now, they're viciously engaged in a civil war against the masses, but they might use China to spread it to the masses themselves. That's where our role comes in, to fight against that as much as we can, to push back against that as much as we can, to do our best, right? In other countries where the ruling bourgeoisie fears an early outbreak, fascism establishes its unrestricted political monopoly, either immediately or by intensifying its reign of terror against all rival parties and groups. What about those domestic terror laws? It does not prevent fascism, when its position becomes particularly acute, from trying to extend its bases and without altering its class nature, trying to combine open terrorist dictatorship with a crude sham of parliamentarism. So that's what happens in Ukraine, right? You have an open terrorist dictatorship of the Azovites, but you still have a crude sham of parliamentarism. I mean, do you really think things in Ukraine are decided by Zelensky or by parliament? No. It's decided by the Azov thugs and militias who have all the, they've won the master-slave dialectic in Ukraine. They're the people who are willing to fight for something and willing to die for something. Therefore, they control Ukraine. The Ukrainian military just gets its orders from the political state. They're not going to fight and die for an ideology or a cause like the Azovites are. So it's that quote-unquote National Guard that has power in Ukraine. The ascension to power of fascism is not an ordinary succession of one bourgeois government to another, but a substitution of one state form of class domination of the bourgeoisie, from bourgeois democracy to open terrorist dictatorship. That's what we're facing here in this country. I mean, being advanced, aided, and abetted by the left, who are fighting the info wars, the rank and file, for them. Now, I'm going to talk about MK Ultra and the LGBT movement only for one reason, okay? It seems like, even before I said anything critical about that movement, it seems like the most active vanguard, people who are willing to, for free, fight the info war against me and to destroy the anti-imperialist message, were somehow people brainwashed into thinking that if they didn't oppose me, they could not sustain or protect their sexual identity. So they attached their sexual identity with loyalty to the imperialist state. If that's not a form of MK Ultra, I don't fucking know what is. Somehow, the American state has gotten people to attach their very sexuality with loyalty to the agenda of imperialism. That's pretty fucking scary. And if you think that's just a coincidence, I think you're naive. I think there's a reason why that is. Why is the LGBT movement inherently progressive? And why, hypothetically, is the LGBT movement used as the measurement of whether someone's fascist or not? I just want to know what's fascist about rejecting the LGBT movement. I mean, I don't know if I would even say I reject the LGBT movement. I just want to know why people use that to define what fascism is. Because I'm reading Dimitrov, and I read Dimitrov. I've read the classics of Marxism-Leninism. And for them, fascism is very clearly defined as the rule, the open dictatorship of the most reactionary and warmongering elements of finance capital. I mean, nowhere in there do I find anything about sexual minorities or something. I don't know why that's relevant to what fascism is. I don't know why that's relevant to why people define it. I want to know why all these Marxists, where are you getting your idea of progress? Is progress just following the latest agenda that's adopted in institutions? Now, to be a little bit good faith, I think a lot of these people say, okay, this trend was adopted by MTV on the TV, which means it has become historically consolidated as an irreversible form of progress, and therefore anyone who is indifferent to it or is not getting on board with it must be a reactionary. But why are you using the media and corporations as the barometer of what is an irreversible form of progress when those things often contradict the actual cultural trends that take root in society, not just from the top down as some kind of social engineering project? So I want to know why these people are using the word fascism in the way they are. Again, fascism, in terms of its psychological characteristics, is indistinguishable if you just look at it from ultra-leftism, right? It's a form of psychological perversion. It's a form of psychosis, right? Psychologically, but its linchpin is war. I don't know how you can have this idea that all of these anti-war people could be fascists when fascism can clearly be defined by pro-war chauvinism. By the way, when these people use the word chauvinism, they weren't talking about a guy manspreading on the subway. They were talking about the warmongering policy of the state and by the ruling class to attack other countries and attack, subjugate, and enslave other nations. I mean, that's what chauvinism meant in the communist lexicon. Okay, it didn't mean manspreading on the subway or microaggressions, yada, yada, yada. So I just want to know why leftists are using the word fascism in the way they are. I also want to point out that, and I'm going to read you Dimitrov himself, right, to show you why, if you're against Pat Socks, you are at the very minimum aiding and abetting fascism. Because in his section about the ideological struggle against fascism, Dimitrov points it out as a weakness. One of the weakest aspects of the anti-fascist struggle of our parties is that they inadequately react and too slowly to the fascist demagoguery and neglect the problem with struggling against fascist ideology. So this is what they say, right? Fascists are rummaging through the entire history of every nation so as to be able to pose as the heirs and continuers of all that was exalted and heroic in the past. And, you know, they're lying about the German nation and the history of the German nation. He gives several examples. Mussolini is trying to be the heir of Garibaldi. French fascists are trying to be the heirs of Joan of Arc. American fascists are appealing to the founding fathers and Lincoln. The Bulgarian fascists are making use of the historical national liberation movement of the 70s and its heroes beloved by the people, Vasilevsky, Stepan Karaj, and others. Now, what Dimitrov says is that communists who oppose that, who do nothing to enlighten the masses on the past of their people in a historically correct fashion, in a genuinely Marxist-Leninist spirit, who do nothing to link up the present struggle with the people's revolutionary traditions and past, voluntarily hand over to the fascist falsifiers all that is valuable in the historical past of the nations, so that the fascists may fool the masses. So Dimitrov is spelling it out outright. He's saying that all of these so-called leftists who are not interpreting history in a Marxist-Leninist way and reclaiming all of these figures in a communistic way are handing over to the fascist falsifiers all that is valuable. Now, the reason I'm going to say that the anti-Patsocks in the American context are just fascists outright is because they directly agree with the fascists that all of these great historical figures, at least in the eye of the majority of the people in the countries within which they're trying to operate, they're agreeing with the fascists that these are inherently fascist figures and yada, yada, yada. These are inherently Nazi figures. And then Dimitrov says, we are concerned with every important question, not only of the present and future, but also of the past and of our own peoples. We communists do not pursue a narrow policy based on the craft interests of the workers. We are not narrow-minded trade union functionaries or leaders of medieval guilds. We are representative of the class interests of the most important and greatest class of modern society. So what that means is that while we oppose, in principle, bourgeois nationalism in all its forms, we are not supporters of national nihilism. This is what Dimitrov says, and we should never act as such. The task of educating the workers and all working people in the spirit of proletarian internationalism is one of the fundamental tasks of the Communist Party. But anyone who thinks that this permits him or even compels him to sneer at the national sentiments of the broad masses of working people is far from being a genuine Bolshevik and has understood nothing of the teaching of Lenin on the national question. And then he quotes Lenin to point out that national pride is important and that we do have national pride. So he said, I think, comrades, that when at the Reichstag fire trial the fascists tried to slander the Bulgarians as a barbarous people, I was not wrong in taking up the defense of the national honor of the working masses of the Bulgarian people, who are struggling heroically against the fascist usurpers. I had no cause to be ashamed of being a Bulgarian. On the contrary, I was proud of being the son of the heroic Bulgarian working class. Now, if you're going to say, oh, that's because the Bulgarians were oppressed, at the time that Dimitrov was writing this, there was a huge fascist movement within Bulgaria. The fascists within Bulgaria eventually assumed power. They assumed the reins of power, okay? So he's saying that in spite of that fact, right? He said proletarian internationalism must, so to speak, acclimatize itself in each country in order to strike deep roots in the native land. These are language that we have used, we so-called Patsocks have used, and because of this language, we were called fascist. Dimitrov, in each country in order to strike deep roots in its native land. National forms of proletarian class struggle and of the labor movement in the individual countries are in no contradiction to proletarian internationalism. On the contrary, it is precisely in these forms that the international interests of the proletariat can be successfully defended. So Dimitrov is spelling it out directly. Without the national forms, the international interests of the proletarian class cannot be successfully defended. It is only within the national form that proletarian internationalism can be defended. That's what Dimitrov says, okay? Now, it goes without saying that it is everywhere and on all occasions to expose before the masses and to prove to them concretely the fascist bourgeoisie, on the pretext of defending general national interests, in conducting its selfish policy of oppressing and exploiting its own people, as well as robbing and enslaving other nations. So we oppose that, right? We must at the same time prove by the very struggle of the working class and of the actions of the communist parties that the proletariat, in rising against every manner of bondage and national oppression, is the only true fighter for national freedom and the independence of the people. The interests of the class struggle of the proletariat against its native exploiters and oppressors are not in contradiction to the interests of a free and happy future of the nation. On the contrary, the socialist revolution will signify the salvation of the nation and will open it up to the road of loftier heights. language we have used that they used as evidence that we're fascists and we're using fascist sentiment. Here's Dimitrov saying it directly to teach communists how to fight fascism. He said, socialist revolution will signify the salvation of the nation and will open up to it the road to loftier heights. Loftier heights of the nation, salvation of the nation. Imagine if we use this language. By the very fact of building at the present time its class organizations and consolidating its positions, by the very fact of defending democratic rights and liberties against fascism, and mind you, what that means concretely does not mean something about toilets. Democratic rights and liberties are our democratic rights and liberties. You know, the ones that have been under assault by things like the Patriot Act and under the Obama regime and, you know, even under Trump. But I don't know if that was by him or the people controlling him. Doesn't matter either way. And now under Biden, our actual bourgeois democratic rights and liberties, not this ambiguous, academically contrived idea of liberation that they have. These are now under assault. And it's progressives leading the way in their campaign to promote censorship. You look at the source material, you read Dimitrov, and then you ask the question, how the fuck are we fascists? How do these people sustain the idea that we're somehow fascists? How are they defining fascism? Where are they getting this very bizarre, very bizarre idea of what fascism is? Where are they getting it from? Look at this. The revolutionary proletariat is fighting to save the culture of the people, to liberate it from the shackles of decaying monopoly capitalism, from barbarous fascism, which is laying violent hands on it. Only the proletarian revolution can avert the destruction of culture and raise it to its highest flowering as a truly national culture, national in form and socialist in content, which is being realized in the Soviet Union before our eyes. I mean, we say this word for word. I mean, I want you guys to do a test. If you get into an argument with one of these Twitter dumbasses, just repeat Dimitrov and act like it's your own words. Like, oh my God, this is such fascist language. So Dimitrov has a very specific understanding of fascism. Now, clearly it has nothing to do with an understanding that the class struggle is deeply national in nature, that communists have to be deeply national and deeply patriotic. It has nothing to do with that. So now we have to ask the question, it's about the culture war. Well, why is taking a position on the culture war of indifference or even rejection of these latest trends pushed by the corporate media, why is that inherently fascist? What is inherently fascist about that? They're saying, well, having conservative social values. Well, this is the thing. The Soviet Union had very conservative social values. Almost every communist state had very conservative social values. China today, I mean, they are pursuing a very family-oriented policy of pronatalism, which is extremely conservative compared to America. I mean, they're encouraging women to have children, encouraging families like no state has ever done before. Is that fascist? I mean, a lot of leftists say that China is fascist because of things like that, right? But I think people have this idea that, you know, fascists represent the deeply national, you know, atavistic revival of the nation. It's two people who characterize fascism this way. Fascists themselves and these dumb fuck mystifiers and falsifiers coming from the left who are giving the fascists what they want, which is the nation. As Dimitrov said, they're handing over the nation to the fascists. They're agreeing with the fascists' false pretensions. Dimitrov said the fascists are not deeply national. They serve international finance capital. They pretend and disguise themselves in the forms of the nation with all this mystical, obfuscatory bullshit that they're representing the true, authentic nation. Dimitrov says, no, they are lying. They're falsifying that. But the leftists, the ultra-leftists are here saying, they're saying, no, the fascists are right. That is truly the nation. We have to curb our national instincts and curb our sentiments and all hold hands in a circle together because fascism is really scary. It's like Thor, the god of thunder. It's really scary. It's like thunder, right? They're literally jacking off the fascists and fulfilling their twisted little fantasy for them instead of pushing back in any capacity. They are fascists, two sides of the same coin. Base. Anyway, what I'm trying to say here is that you look at the case of the Maidan, and in the Maidan you had this vicious uprising of these urban thugs, these lumpen of Ukraine, supported by international finance capital, and being a quote-unquote anarchist and a banderist was indistinguishable. Being a fascist and an ultra-leftist in that context was totally indistinguishable. America, you have a similar base in terms of these declassed Chaz type of people, these formerly middle-class people who were from the suburbs but got declassed, so they moved to cities, they became heavily urbanized, so there's these thugs and there are these lumpen. These are also the same hooligans that would be the rank and file of fascism. So ironically, the people who make up Antifa in the United States, that is the rank and file of fascism. 100%. 100%. Fascism has never represented any authentic, deeply nationally rooted reality. It has always been an exaggerated form of pageantry in order to use the nation as this edgy way to kind of give expression to the inherent contradictions within liberalism. Well, ultra-leftists and so-called anarchists, they do the exact same thing, whether they're Maoists, whether they're anarchists. All they do is perversely give expression to the contradictions internal to liberalism instead of actually offering a positive alternative. In terms of the culture war, they point out various cultural inequalities that persist in the sphere of culture, and they basically wear this as their mark to point out how liberalism is not able to achieve equality in the sphere of culture, and that's this inherent contradiction within liberalism. But Marx and Engels had already pointed out that equality is an inherently bourgeois principle in the first place. You can't apply equality outside of the sphere of political forms. So making a fuss of that it's all you're doing is giving expression and giving manifestation to the psychosis of liberalism, which is unable to reconcile itself with the fact that it has to confine itself only to a very specific sphere of society, which is the state and legal forms, despite being an ideology which is meant to encompass and account for the whole of society. So liberalism, whereupon it encounters these kinds of contradictions, and I'm just talking about this on an ideological level, not even from a materialist level, right? It gives rise to fascism. And leftists are just as much culpable in that as actual fascists. Actually, I don't know what an actual fascist is in America. You look at the Azovites in Ukraine, and they are outright neo-Nazi fascists. You have neo-Nazis in the United States, outright neo-Nazis. It's just, I'm not sure those people will be numerous or strong enough to actually give expression to the actual fascist tendency that we're witnessing in this country, which is most definitely coming from the ultra-left. And all you have to do is look at that from the perspective of which social force within the United States is doing the most to accelerate the destruction of bourgeois democracy and basic bourgeois liberties. It is clearly the ultra-leftists. It's clearly these Nazlibs, right? It's, on the one hand, the Nazi terrorists and criminals who are from the same social class, by the way, as the ultra-leftists. And on the other hand, it's also the ultra-leftists on an institutional level. On a civil society level, it's the neo-Nazis. On an institutional level, it's the ultra-leftists. On the dark web, it's the neo-Nazis. On the surface web, it's the ultra-leftists. The two come from the same class and are working indirectly together to give rise to a fascism in the 21st century. We know all of this shit is coming from the decadence and the decay of capitalism and of monopoly capitalism in particular, and it's trying to save itself. But the way that manifests itself ideologically, who is closest to that ideology that we could see on the surface? I think it is ultra-leftists. I think ultra-leftists are closest to that ideology because they have the most destructive and nihilistic attitude toward humanity, and they don't make any pretense to demagogic appeal to the masses in any capacity. They literally say, we hate the masses, we're against the masses. The masses don't even exist. They're just the sum total of individuals and atoms. All they do is just appeal to individually contrived identities and basically say the only real thing is what an individual chooses. I mean, this is Luciferian Satanism, which is, I think, closest to the actual ideology of the ruling class. Although it's not the same, because the ruling class also laughs at the leftist moralism and idea that this is, you know, to be just or to make people more equitable and to make life happier for people and whatever. I mean, they laugh at that idea, but they do share in common with leftists this basic idea that the only thing that's real is what comes out of the mind of the individual, that everything else is somehow, you know, false, or it's a sham, or it has to be destroyed or liquefied or something like that. So, you know, all this rhetoric against Pat socks, you have to notice that the reason that it's becoming popular is not because MLs are becoming more popular. It's because these NATO Nazlibs, supporters of the Azov, the Azovites, they know that we are the most ferocious opponents of Zelensky's apocalyptic delusions and the pro-thermonuclear extinction contingent from Europe who wants to drag America into World War III. They know we are the most vocal opponents of that, and we're also some of the most effective opponents of that because we combine genuine and authentic patriotism with an anti-war and anti-imperialist position. And they know that's a winning message, so that's why these people are the most vicious opponents of us more than anyone. So you're seeing in real time a unity of the Nazlibs and all of the fake Baizwo MLs, the people who pretend to be Marxist-Leninists, but are, as a matter of fact, Nazis, and more specifically Nazlibs. And we need to start popularizing that term, ladies and gentlemen, Nazlibs, because it's a real thing. So these are Nazlibs, right? That's what we're dealing with. They call us Nazbols, which is purely projection. The only thing they get right about is that we are Bolsheviks, right? We are Marxist-Leninists. So what they're doing is they're actually talking about Nazlibs. They're talking about these libs, they're liberals, who are becoming so psychotic that they're transforming and they're fusing into Nazism, outright Nazism. And you do see a spontaneous, implicit solidarity between outright neo-Nazis and ultra-leftists, specifically when it comes to like the people who are against us. They get along really well when it comes to opposing us. And that's not accidental, right? That's for a reason.